Hey everybody, welcome to XSC Chat. I'm Serge.
I'm Rob.
I'm Gen Z.
I'm Gen X.
And yesterday we did a reaction to Cliffs of Gallipoli by Sabaton. And it was a really powerful song. There's a lot of powerful words. And it got us even more intrigued about the history behind the song because we weren't too familiar with the battle itself. We knew some general information about it, but now we're excited because we get to dive into a more detailed overview of the battle by anzacday and the lead singer of Sabaton. So we're going to see what they have to say. And thank you guys for letting us know that this Sabaton history video is divided into two parts. What we'll do is we'll react to both parts in this video.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Indy's a very interesting historian. So.
Yeah, and thank you for making sure to remember the name. For me, the way, even though it's not spelled the same way, the way I remember it is there's something known as indie games. So I just kind of, that's how I remember. That's my little trick for remembering his name.
Ah, you're mnemonic. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
So.
All right. I like it because it's just a cool name.
Yeah.
I remember it.
So, with that being said, are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready to dive in. Yeah, I want to hear what these guys have to share and teach us.
Yeah.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History.
I like the little intro they did there.
Now, this song is going to be covered in 2 episodes, so I can cover 2 aspects of the topic. Gallipoli. For 8 months in 1915, that name was headline news worldwide.
And our song, Cliffs of Gallipoli, is a tribute to the men who fought and died there.
The Great War was just a half-year old, but casualties had already risen to unthinkable levels. British soldiers were dying by the tens of thousands in the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. Leading politicians began looking for an alternative to the slaughter in the trenches. Most vocal among them were Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, who thought that instead of trying to beat the Germans in Flanders, they should strike towards the weakest link of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. They believed the Ottoman military to be second-rate, more of a nuisance than an equal. Churchill envisioned a strike against Constantinople itself by sea. Taking the Turkish capital would drive the Ottomans out of the war and open up a direct shipping route towards Britain's Russian ally. Indirectly, it would safeguard British interests in Mesopotamia and Suez as well. So on paper, this seemed like a total win-win for the Allies. A major reason...
Wow, it's interesting that he mentions that because that was just what I was thinking was so far everything he's describing sounds like a really good idea. Tactically, it makes sense that you're knocking out one of the enemy powers, so they're completely getting knocked out of the war. You're opening a direct trade route into Russia, which is their ally. So that way you're connected and you can send each other reinforcements or resupply each other if needed. So on paper, it makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the things I was wondering was, what is the controversy behind this conflict? And it sounds like he's leading into that. The way he's speaking is that he's about to explain why this was a bad idea, right?
And Russia would want their ally to have a direct connection too, with the Black Sea being a warm sea and Crimea having warm water ports. It would be perfect for trade as well as weaponry and warfare resupplying.
Right, yeah. All right, let's continue.
For the British hubris was the recent military record of the Ottoman Empire. Serious defeats during the Balkan Wars and the recent catastrophic outcome of the Battle of Sarikamish just weeks ago, where tens of thousands of soldiers froze to death in the Caucasus Mountains, painted a picture of incompetent leaders and a badly equipped and trained Ottoman military. The sick man at the Bosporus would be no match for the professional British soldiers.
Oh, he just called my mind back to something I learned in school. Have you heard of the sick old man of Europe terminology before?
The sick man of Europe? No.
No. So this is something that was commonly referred to. I learned this from one of my history teachers, where essentially the Ottoman Empire used to be really powerful, and then eventually it grew weaker over time, and it became known as the sick old man of Europe because it was seen as really weak and really it was like one of the weak links of Europe is what it was seen as. And it's interesting what he's mentioned here because it seems like they were being kind of the Allied force was kind of looking down on the Ottomans, thinking that was going to be an easy target.
Right.
We're just going to take care of this, and then we can move on to the rest of the war. So far it's being set up as a really easy, from their perspective. So it's a little bit arrogant as well. So.
Absolutely, yeah. It sounds very arrogant. And this reminds me of how it plays into, at the time, social Darwinism. And that was a very active part of how at the time considered first world nations thought about, well, European nations thought about all other nations,
Right.
really, particularly with the Ottoman Empire and their empire being one primarily over the Middle East.
Right.
They saw the culture and the people as inferior, so thought maybe they would be an easier target.
Yeah, they
Could be.
So they thought they weren't as disciplined, like in terms of like military strategy. They weren't as advanced in terms of their society, and so they basically looked down on the Ottomans, thinking that this was going to be an easy fight. When in reality, the Ottomans were very much not so much pushovers, right?
No, they had an empire. It was the largest empire at the time for centuries.
Right,
So
yeah.
they definitely were not a pushover. So,
All
yeah,
right, let's-
interesting. Good point. Thanks for teaching me about the sick man of Europe. Is that
Yeah,
what it was called?
I think it was "sick old man of Europe." It was a phrase.
Okay.
I just remember
I haven't heard that
one
one,
of my teachers, history teachers in class. He basically mentioned that phrase, and it just kind of stuck in my mind.
Yeah.
And he just called me
There
back
it
to it.
is.
So, and also interesting little side note. I'm looking at his shirt, and I'm wondering what it says.
Yeah.
I'm not sure because to me, when I was reading it, I was thinking like maybe along the lines of we got a problem with you got a problem with the way I clean my cat or something. That's not what it says, but that was just I don't know why that's the first thing that stood out in my mind because I have a cat, and so I see the way the letters are being covered up on his shirt. It looks like it says "cat" down there.
So, yeah, on another note, those of you that are watching, if you have it figured out, put it in the comments. I was trying to figure it out as well, so it's funny that you called it out just now.
Yeah.
Let us know.
Yeah. So, ready to continue?
Let's continue.
All right, let's jump back in.
Come on, Indy.
There was, however, a major obstacle along the way. To strike against Constantinople, any Allied fleet would have to penetrate the Straits of the Dardanelles that guard the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. And those straits were narrow and had been a natural line of defense for centuries.
No.
And the sick man was not as sick as the British believed.
Right.
Since the Balkan Wars, the defenses of the straits had been continually improved and ammunition restocked. In addition to long-range guns, the Ottomans had mobile 120-millimeter howitzer batteries on the ready, highly trained troops, and line after line of mines in the waters.
It's interesting that he mentioned this as well because something similar. I feel like this is something that's similar that happened in World War II with the Soviet Union in a sense that, and what I mean by that is after a series of bad hiccups, like a badly participating conflicts, the Allied nations in this case thought that the Ottomans would be easy to take out because they had several bad outcomes, right? Where they had soldiers freeze to death and they had all these mishaps. The same thing happened, I feel like, in World War II, where one of the reasons I saw in a documentary that Hitler attacked the Soviet Union was that he thought that they were weak. He thought they'd be easy to take over. And the reason for that is that right before World War II, the Soviet Union had a series of battles in which it performed very poorly, including the Battle of Finland, in which it was like a disastrous outcome for them, and it made them look really incompetent in front of the entire world and seem like an easy target. So I feel like this is kind of like an earlier example of that because this is a World War I case of something similar happening.
Yeah, that's right. Interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. And then, not too much history had gone by since the loss of the battle they also had with Japan. I think it was, and again from memory here, 1904, 1906. And in that war, it was the first time in history that a European country had lost a war, a war to a non-European country. And so that was a really big deal. And that stained, at the time, Russia and carried over to the Soviet Union just as far as their capability.
Right. Yeah, that was you're referring to the World War II conflict, of course.
Yes, referring to World War II.
Yeah, and
right.
just like
I'm sorry, the battle was 1904, 1906, but the stain of the reputation.
Right. It
carried
made
over.
Yeah, because Russia became one of the main foundations of the Soviet Union, and so that kind of that shame carried over.
Right.
But what's interesting is then what happened was what Hitler didn't account for was then after those conflicts, Russia started to step up the Soviet Union started to step up their tank production. They started developing much more much stronger tanks, and there's a few encounters that the Germans had in which they started to get encouraged to build even better tanks in return. But here, same thing. The Ottomans are gearing up. They're getting better artillery, better guns, and better discipline in order to remedy their past mistakes.
Sure. Yeah.
Under Çanakkale Fortified Area Command of General Fahri Pasha, the Dardanelles became the most fortified area of the whole Ottoman Empire. The British and French fleets tried to force passage through the straits. Even a modern warship can be sunk by a single mine, though. And after disaster on March
Wow.
18th,
Look at this. Yeah, that's
1915,
an interesting
when the
image.
Ottomans sank 3 Allied battleships and severely damaged 3 more, the Allies had to rethink.
Wow, it's so cool that we get to see the footage from back in the day of warships. I wouldn't think that it'd be.
Cross flag over there. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, look at that. It's like
The artillery positions on the hills had to be taken out first by land if the operation towards Constantinople was to succeed. The task was given to General Sir Ian Hamilton, in overall command of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. The MEF included, along with British units, the ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, under General Sir William Birdwood. ANZAC had been heading for Britain before being diverted to Egypt. Instead of fighting Germans, they would now fight the Ottomans. The Australian...
And of course, this is something that we recently learned, was that Anzac Day is Australian and New Zealanders. So it's basically representing that fighting force.
Mm-hmm. Right.
New Zealanders, and Maoris of Anzac considered themselves natural soldiers, men hardened by daily outdoor activity, and the aggressive and unruly character of the Anzacs seemed perfect for the task ahead. The MEF was further strengthened by an Indian brigade and the Gurkha Rifles, who joined the Anzacs and a French force at Malta in early March. The French government was not too keen on the whole endeavor, but they themselves had their own ambitions in the Middle East and could not simply leave it all to the British if they succeeded in toppling the Ottomans. The French created the 1st Division Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient, made up of regular French troops, the French Foreign Legion, and Senegalese and Zouave forces. Once again, though, the planning phase betrayed the arrogance of British high command. While generals on the western or eastern fronts made plans for all sorts of eventualities and for a quick exit if everything suddenly went to hell, nothing of the sort was prepared for the Gallipoli landings. Instead, Hamilton's plan was overambitious, and it had one critical flaw. It all depended on the Ottoman inability to stand up to the invaders. But what if they did not turn and run?
Yeah, and that's
Which they did not.
Which they did not, and that seems really crazy that they wouldn't have accounted for like a backup plan or an exit strategy, like they did in all the other aspects of the war. It sounds like they were really arrogant. They just thought they could just blaze through and just instantly just win this fight and then just move on to the next thing. Which is really surprising because it even said at the very beginning, right? They had several of their warships that were sunk. They sunk and damaged as well. So that means that their first attempt was unsuccessful, and so you would think that that would be like a good sign.
Let's get a plan B.
Yeah, let's get a plan B.
Plan C.
A good sign to tread with some caution. But no, it seems like they thought that they could still take it very easily, which is surprising.
Yeah. No, key word there, the arrogance, which is also pride, right? I mean, the pride in that, and I think of Book of Proverbs says pride is stupidity.
Oh, interesting.
It is real interesting. As I've learned and grown up, that used to confuse me when I was younger, but I understand that so much more now. That the more pride, the more stupidity, and so that's what we see here. I mean, unfortunately, the stupidity of losing all these lives and not winning this battle. Of course, that being the goal there. So.
Yeah, you have to be careful because overconfidence or pride can easily turn into cockiness.
Right. So, yeah.
And instead stood and fought.
I'm interested how they found all this footage.
The German influence over the Ottoman forces was personified by General Otto Liman von Sanders in command of the 5th Army at Gallipoli. Ever since the naval attacks, it was thought that an invasion might take place. And the British did little to hide their intentions. In fact, the Greek newspapers ran headlines about the coming landings.
Wow.
Oh my gosh. Really?
Yeah. So, how does that happen? Go ahead.
This is
thoughts on this.
This is extremely stupid. In World War II, the Allied forces did the exact opposite, which was a smart strategy, which is for D-Day, they intentionally misled where they were going to land. So what they did was I think they had like a body, like an officer or a standard soldier who had some like documents, and they pretended that these were classified documents that were detailing the location of where the Allied forces were going to land in France. But in reality, those documents were fake. to mislead the German forces in thinking that they're going to land at a separate beach. But in this case, not only are they not trying to mislead their enemy, it's even being headlined where they're landing.
They're leading them into their plan.
Yeah, it's
Exact
like,
opposite.
hey, by the way, we're gonna invade over here, guys.
Yeah. Great example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that you bring that one up. Yeah, and you look at the contrast
Yeah.
with that, and then of course the success and outcome out of it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so far there's he's showing a lot of signs of why this attack was unsuccessful. There's the arrogance of thinking that they don't need a plan B. There was them even being known ahead of time that they're going to land.
Right.
So, yeah, really really bad setup for this conflict.
Yeah, it wasn't even intercepted information. Here it was being broadcasted on the headlines
Right.
of newspapers. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
But the Gallipoli Peninsula was large, and the Ottoman forces could not guard every beach. Von Sanders decided to put only a screening force as a tripwire defense close to the beaches and keep most of his men in reserve units further back.
Oh, interesting. That's a really neat strategy because it's basically if you can't spread all your forces thin, you just have your forces ready so that they go wherever they're needed. I mean, it sounds. I guess it maybe is a simple idea, but it's a pretty clever one at that.
Right.
So.
Ottoman officers at the front would assess the situation and send in reinforcements where necessary. One such officer was Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, in command of the Ottoman 19th Division. He was familiar with the defenses, and his troops were well-trained, motivated, and equipped. In fact, with the help of German instructors and weapon supplies, it was quite a formidable fighting force. The landings began the night of April 25th. The Anzacs would land on the west of the peninsula at a place called Gabatepe, later known as Anzac Cove. They would build a bridgehead and advance the next day all the way to the heights of Maltepe. The other British troops would land at the tip of the peninsula, Cape Helles, and then take Achibaba and the Kilid Bar Plateau in one fell swoop. After that, they would simply join forces and push the Ottomans from the heights. There were also several diversionary landings around the flanks, with the French landing on the Asian side of the straits at Kumkale. Illuminated by the moon, the Anzac landing craft made their way towards their destination, fighting the strong currents. The beaches were in darkness and all was still, and hopes were high that they would fully surprise the enemy. But as soon as they made ground, the first bullets crashed into the boats. A concert of rapid rifle fire erupted, and the battle for Gallipoli had begun. Anzac was not even facing an entire battalion, but the sudden fire caused confusion as the first casualties began to litter the beaches. As more and more Anzacs landed, the outnumbered Ottomans retreated to higher ground and into prepared trenches. And as the sun rose, they fired freely into the mass of men on the beaches. The Anzacs had been ordered not to load their rifles and instead rushed up the hill, bayonets fixed. But in the...
That's
Why?
Who ordered that?
Right. Yeah. Why would that be an order? Why would that even be a thought?
Yeah.
You're in a war. You're going into battle.
What? Don't load your rifles and run forward? Are they? It's like you're trying to get them killed. This isn't some medieval warfare where you just stab everybody. The bayonets are there to be used as for combat, but it's not supposed to be your primary form of combat.
Exactly.
It's supposed to be your backup plan. Like you fire your bullets, and if you quickly need to get someone and you don't have enough time to reload, then you stab them. It sounds like in this case they had enough time to reload, but they're being told to rush forward before doing so.
They had time to go and they're loaded. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I'm curious if he'll explain what the reason behind this was. If not, I really want to know because I can't think of a single good reason for why they would be ordered to do something so stupid. So let's continue.
Yeah.
Not to load their rifles and instead rushed up the hill, bayonets fixed. But in the dim morning, it was hard to navigate the steep heights and the thorny undergrowth, and the Ottomans fired and retreated further. The Anzacs...
It's a firing line, and it, like you said, retreated further. So the second, before you even can get to them, they're already falling back and shooting and covering their exit as they're doing so.
were soon left...
At the same time, the morale, the defeat, the death, the injury, not being able to fight against your enemy as you're trying to save your comrade who's either suffering or who's dying. It was a scene for victory for the Ottomans. But I'm curious, as we see later, when you look at the numbers, the Ottomans lost such a great a greater percentage. The ratio was so much greater. So I'm curious to see how this progresses.
Right. Yeah. Because obviously,
This initial.
this initial hiccup, they must have gotten a little bit smarter in their strategy as the conflict went on. So the Anzacs kind of adapted to the situation. Before we continue, I just wanted to note it seems like he always has a different background in his videos,
Right.
And it's really neat how he always has all these different artifacts. I wonder, are all of them like authentic, or are some of them like maybe like replicas, like reproduction? Like for example, is this AK over here? It looks like an AK-47. Is it a real one, or is it like a non-fine replica, for example? So
It looks pretty clean, doesn't it?
yeah, it does. But so it could either be maybe like a one off the factory. That was just like kept in really mint
Pristine
condition,
sure.
or it could be a reproduction. Either way, it's still cool. So
thorny undergrowth, and the Ottomans fired and retreated further. The Anzacs were soon left out in the open, trying to make sense of the rough terrain, climbing the high ridges, running through razor-sharp thorns and over slippery stones, soon left the men exhausted, and many fell to accurate Ottoman sniper fire. The maps were totally inadequate, and the officers still standing were overwhelmed by the situation. The Ottomans themselves retreated towards the heights of Chunuk Bair. From the high ground, they could direct artillery fire onto the beaches.
Just shelled them.
yeah,
Mustafa Kemal was among the first to understand that the landings at Anzac Cove were not a diversion, but were the real deal. He ordered his division to Sari Bair, the highest point on the peninsula. But while he himself was trying to get a better view of the situation, he saw exhausted men flooding back from the fighting. Upon ordering them to stop, they declared that the Anzacs were moving up and they themselves had no ammunition left. While Kemal's orderlies were running back to get the division moving, he ordered the men he'd halted to fix their bayonets, turn back to attack with the now famous words, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die."
Wow.
Okay, so now we have stupidity on both sides. Soldiers being ordered on both sides to just rush in and just throw away their lives in a very meaningless way. They literally are telling him, "Hey, we don't have any ammunition." He's like, "Oh, okay, just go and die." This is basically what he's telling him. Because he even says, "I'm not ordering you to attack. I'm ordering you to die." Why? What's the point? It's just even more meaningless death and bloodshed.
Yeah. No, and history repeats itself. We'll stay with this, focus on this, but there's so many comments to be made on how this approach was also taken during World War II on the Eastern Front. But we'll stick on this one. Just crazy.
Yeah.
Just nuts. He quoted, "I don't order you to
Here, I'll go back. I don't
attack.
order you to attack. I order you to die.
Wow.
Imagine hearing that. I'm surprised. I'm surprised no one shot him for saying that. Like if I was one of those guys, let's say all those soldiers, they're saying they're out of ammunition, but there's got to be like at least one or two guys with like a bullet maybe left, but they're really low on ammunition, so they retreated with everyone else, right? Why not want to have one of them open fire on this guy, this little tool who's ordering? Why don't you fix a bayonet and go attack with them then?
Yeah.
Like this is ridiculous.
Hindsight's 2020.
All right, let's go. Let's continue.
The now famous words, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can take our place."
I suppose they just wanted to buy time. Buy time for reinforcement.
Buy times with what? With blood.
Yeah, but it still seems like a bad idea to me.
Wasteful blood.
Wasteful blood, yeah.
Our place.
Wow. What I always wonder when I see this footage is who's recording, who's the cameraman? Is it some civilian? Is it a soldier? And how did they survive to get that footage back? Did they leave before the positions got overwhelmed, or it's just interesting to?
Yeah, I'll bet it's a military person filming this, and I'll bet most of the footage has never been recovered or found because most of it's probably, that's my opinion, probably lost in war on the battlefront.
But that's essentially no. So for every piece of footage we see, there could be 10 times more that was lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I would imagine
that's crazy to think about.
Where the ocean meets the sand, cliffs of burden, where the soldiers rushed into
The pursuing Anzacs were totally caught off guard by the sudden counterattack. Fearing that Ottoman reserves had already arrived, they pulled back. Everywhere around Anzac Cove, the Ottoman resistance began to stiffen. Attempts to cross the ridges were immediately met with heavy fire from an unseen enemy. The invaders were stuck. At Helles, the situation was even worse. Way worse.
No.
This was an obvious landing site, and the Ottoman defenders had prepared thoroughly. As the Allied landing craft closed in on the beaches, they were met with a deadly hail of bullets. Many men were hit before they could make landing. Others panicked and jumped into the water. Many of those drowned, dragged down by their heavy kit. But those that made it out of the boats met belts of barbed wire guarding the beach, trapping them in the open. Soon, bodies littered the beach, and the waves washed ashore blood red. The men lucky enough to make it through huddled down behind a sandbank. At just 5 feet high, around 1.5 meters, it was the only cover available.
Wow. And the picture, the way he's painting the scene reminds me once again of D-Day. There's a movie Saving Private Ryan, where it shows when everyone's storming the beaches, the waves were like that were splashing the beach were blood red because they were covered in blood because there's so many people who are dead there, and there's almost no cover on the beach. They're just running through and they're just trying to get to like the seawall, and it was just like he said, very little cover. And it's reminding me a lot of the way he's painting this scene.
Again, there were only a few Ottoman platoons defending the area, but they had fortified trenches and knew how to use their rifles and field artillery to deadly effect. The British officers could only watch as the landing crafts were blown to pieces. The men at Helles were trapped. Similar scenes happened at the other landing places. Y Beach was shot to pieces, while the attacks on X and S broke down the same way as the main landings without major results. Often forgotten by the history books is the French landing at Calais, the only semi-victory that day. That force, under General Albert d'Amada, was to silence the Ottoman guns on the Asian side of the straits and divert Ottoman troops. Their actual landing was nearly unopposed, but the overall Ottoman forces facing them were far more numerous than on the European side. Fighting for the tiny town lasted all day, but the vicious close-quarter combat was for naught. The invasion plan had failed.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that the diversionary force were the ones who are most successful. When ideally your main force is typically the one that makes the most progress, and your diversion force is just to divert the enemy. So that's interesting.
Yeah, when you call it a semi-successful campaign or
a semi-successful
victory.
outcome on a semi-successful victory on the first day. He said on the first day. So I'm assuming that means it changes with the falling.
And as darkness fell, it came as a relief. For the exhausted Ottomans, it was time to fall back and reorganize and wait for the reserves. For the Allies, the cover of night was a saving grace. Finally, they could make a move. Men could come ashore, the injured could be tended to, and fresh officers could take charge. The wounded flooded back to the medical ships. But the doctors and nurses were not prepared for the amount of casualties. There was not enough room. There was not enough morphine. And even if a wounded man survived, it was still a journey of 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, back to Alexandria to recuperate.
Wow. It sounds like this is also another part of that poor planning ahead of time, thinking that it was going to be a really easy conflict, so that they didn't even have enough room for medical supplies for wounded. That's crazy to think about.
And so the first day of Gallipoli came to an end. But the campaign had only just begun.
How many wasted lives? How many dreams did fade away? Broken promises, they won't be coming home.
So, Joachim, tell us a little bit about the musical side of Cliffs of Gallipoli. Well, that's a good question, Joachim, because it's actually a song that took a long time to write. I started writing it in 2006, and it's actually one of those projects. Sometimes you start writing a song, and it takes a while before you get it done or finish it. But in many cases, it's been lying dormant. You haven't been working actively on it. In the case here, though, I think I constantly wrote on that song almost every day for 2 years.
Wow.
Like, okay, so the finished released version, does it sound very different from when it came out?
Oh, yes and no. I mean, I don't know how many songs. I mean, all the parts that were taken away for that song probably could consist of 2 more songs in it. You know? Same thing for Bismarck, actually. It's probably 3 songs worth of writing in there. It didn't take as long though, but
He said mentioned.
with Cliffs of Gallipoli.
Oh, we'll pause. He mentioned Bismarck. I think that's another song that was recommended to us, so we have that one on the wheel.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. I have to say I really like. He has like a military look to him, like with the shades and then the tattoos. And what I find interesting is he has a unique voice when he sings. I wonder if his accent plays a part in that, in giving him that unique sound.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Because
I'll have to listen more
he
acutely to
rolls
that.
his R's in a very unique way. I noticed whenever he sings.
You've mentioned that.
And
yeah.
I feel like
The eyes.
maybe the accent also helps that. It gives it a more interesting sound.
Gallipoli, I just felt that I had something special going on. And it's not a typical Sabaton song at all. Well, you get these, you fall in love with some of your projects a little bit more.
Right.
And sometimes a little bit too much. This is
Okay.
one of those cases. I really felt it was something I wanted to make perfect as good as I could. And for once, I actually think I couldn't have done it any better. Probably someone else could, but at least
your
I
song.
couldn't. And it's one of the few times where a guitar solo I wrote ended up on the album.
Aha. Now, did,
And it sounds like so this was a really big passion project for him. Like this was one of the ones he was really passionate about and really invested in. He said like every day for 2 years.
For 2 years.
And the amount of material that he wrote, it could be 2 more songs. That's how much was thrown out.
Yeah, it's 2 or 3 more songs, I think.
Yeah, just to make it
Yeah.
perfect. And it's crazy to think about how much work goes into just one song.
Obviously, on his heart and mind for 2 years, this one song.
Yeah. Wow.
did you write the music and the words, or did you just write the music and the words?
The lyrics was written with me and Per together.
Okay.
Yes, really one of the most fantastic stories. And in most cases, we actually get to visit the sites we sing about
Right.
after we've done the song.
Oh yeah, sure.
And in this case, when we came to Gallipoli the first time, that is spooky because it's like paradise.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful there.
Wow.
And then you think, you're walking around, where are the trenches? And then you almost fall and break your leg. It's like, okay, I guess there are the trenches.
There they are.
Yeah. Wow. I think it'd be really cool to visit some of these places that they have visited as well, to see that battlefield. And like you said, it's very different because now it's like some of it has been regrown, right? There's like more beautiful scenery and grass. It doesn't look like a battlefield, so you might even trip, not realizing you're about to walk into a trench.
Well, that's such a different contrast in the same war. Like, we've talked about, and we visited together, like locations on the Western Front at Verdun and stuff. And it is really somber. And you feel that there's been war here.
Wow.
But when you're like overlooking the Dardanelles and stuff, it's just fantastically beautiful. You don't think, there's earthworks and that they've rebuilt, and there's some physical buildings and defenses, but you don't see it unless you're thinking of it, that this was a place where thousands upon thousands of people died in horrible conditions.
No, and I
I have to stop and pause just for a second to say, and that's one thing I really appreciate with Sabaton and what they're doing with their music, because they're bringing to life history that really should be remembered. Let's not forget it. And so, as you just said as well, it'd be great to go to these places and to go and visit them, not just to look at, wow, it's a beautiful place, but then to stop and really silence to reflect on what happened there.
Yeah.
And you can imagine just in that 24-hour period in the initial invasion, aside from many months that carried on after that, but just in that 24-hour period, all the thoughts and feelings that were going through people's minds, everything they were just experiencing, rushing through. And then now we see nothing but just maybe something that's very touristic.
Yeah, and it's interesting to know. It's like you'll see like a bunker here and there, and it's overgrown by like vines and grass and greenery, because it's like history's kind of just been buried a little bit. And there's only a few remnants that remain of what happened there in the battlefield, and most of it is gone. It was either picked apart or overgrown, and very little remains other than the memories. So.
I also think that I would have done things differently. If me and Per had been there and seen that, we would have built in some parallels of, the contrast of then and now in a way.
Oh, that'd be very interesting too. Well, maybe you could write another song about Gallipoli.
Yeah, this one gets 2 episodes, so maybe we should cover it again.
And you've got all that extra music that didn't make the final. So you've got.
Yeah.
That is actually a really brilliant
So,
idea.
so you've made Cliffs of Gallipoli. This could be like the bays of Gallipoli, or the sea of Gallipoli, or the Dardanelles.
The shores of Gallipoli.
Shores of Gallipoli. I see.
Ah.
All right. So on your second album, Great War Part 2, that's going to come out. Your 90s R&B album comes out in 2020.
Yes,
That's going to have Shores of Gallipoli on it.
Yes, a trap beat. Cool, man.
All right. Well, I think we've all learned something today.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Joachim.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time.
He seems like a cheery dude.
Yeah.
Wow.
Someone in the comments wrote that they had a tour in North America.
Oh.
So that was good to read.
Yeah.
All right,
I hope
here's
you
some
do another
cool
one.
stuff coming. We're gonna do our older albums with the History Channel editions. That's got indie speaking. It's cool as I can't say that word. Anyway, you should become a Patreon because then you can get that stuff. See you soon.
All right.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
That was a fun one. So that was it was really interesting. I like how detailed they went into the history. They even, and I think one of the chilling moments was that one quote that he said, "I'm not ordering you to attack. I'm ordering you to die." This is pretty crazy. And I guess as cold-hearted as it was, probably the intention behind it was, like you said, to buy more time because they really wanted to make sure that they did not lose Gallipoli or Constantinople, right?
Ultimately, yeah.
So pretty
Further up the
powerful.
street. Yeah.
What do you think?
Again, the song was incredible and excellent, which is why we had to listen to and watch this history
The history
overview
behind
of it. And it's just very educational, but enlightening as well. Enlightening because you hear not just numbers of people who died, but you hear kind of what happened and some of the reasoning behind it and what was going on. Like you and I were talking about, it's just crazy how if you want to surprise attack an enemy,
Yeah,
you're letting all the information get out there.
Yeah.
And there's more to think about with this as well. What was shared, not just that. But I'm really not impressed, but I'm just really glad that Indy and the group have this relationship where Indy as a historian can then reflect on the songs and share them with us. A lot of great meaning there.
Yeah, really well done. I really like how everything was summarized in a really neat way. I'm curious where they're going to take it with the next part, which we're about to jump into. I'm curious. I'm guessing what's going to happen is they're going to continue from what they've told us about. I'm guessing it's the continuation of how the conflict progressed and, of course, its final outcome. So I'm curious to see what they will speak about. So.
Me too. And with that said,
Ready
let's
to jump
find
in?
out.
Let's find out. Let's jump into the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to bring up the next one, and we're going to continue on. So now we have the second part, and let's see how Indy Nidell, he continues his explanation and his neat summary of the events that occurred, and how they unfolded, and of course, what was the outcome of the battle. Ultimately, we know that it was a loss for the Allied forces, and the Ottomans did succeed in holding the ground. But I'm curious to know some of the more specifics and like the specific numbers behind what happened. So, ready?
Let's play it.
Let's play.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Per from Sabaton, and this is Sabaton History.
This is part 2 of Cliffs of Gallipoli. Now, we covered this song in 2 episodes, so I could cover 2 aspects of the topic.
And the song took us all the way from Sweden to Turkey.
The initial Gallipoli landings, which we covered in part 1, had been both a tactical and strategic failure. The Allied troops held onto their beachheads and had managed to conquer a few ridges and hills around the landing sites, but that was nothing compared to the objectives set for them. The invasion plans were far too ambitious and were based on the belief that the Ottomans would be easy enemies to defeat. By May, the Allies should have cleared the whole peninsula. Instead, the Ottomans had the advantage, and they brought in reinforcements, machine guns and howitzers, while fortifying the higher ground. German General Lehmann von Sanders had had time to read the reports of his Turkish officers and commit his reserves. And although their localized counterattacks were stopped by the invaders, it was clear that they would not just sit and remain passive forever. On the night of May 19th, the Ottomans gathered a large force of fresh reinforcements from Constantinople and Smyrna under Esad Pasha. Thousands of cheerful young men, praying for God's help, went over the top towards the enemy. But the Anzacs facing them had been well aware of the build-up to the attack. As daylight broke, 10,000 casualties littered the narrow fields of no man's land, piled on top of one another. Like everywhere in this war, The firepower of entrenched machine guns and determined riflemen had created an impassable wall. And the Ottomans learned a lesson by blood. Never again here would they try to attack on such a large scale, and instead would focus on smaller skirmishes, raids, and their relentless snipers.
Wow. So just how they capture the shot right as people are running out of
Soon,
trenches.
the stench of rotting flesh in the summer's heat was too much to bear. A short armistice was arranged, and men from both sides went onto the battlefield to bury the dead. It was the first time here that the men came to know each other without violence. Curious looks and even small gifts were exchanged.
Interesting.
Trench warfare set in on the Gallipoli Peninsula.
But it's interesting that he mentioned that because it kind of reminds me of the Christmas shoes that they were talking about earlier, where they exchanged gifts and they were able to see each other for the first time. And
as people.
As people, so it kind of humanizes the other side a little bit, which I'm curious to see if he touches on. Did it make it a little bit more difficult for them to fight afterwards? Like, did it change their perspective at all? So, ready to continue?
Let's see.
And soldiers on both sides realized they were going to be there for a while. To escape the constant threat of shells and sniper fire, men began to disappear under the earth, into trenches and dugouts. The peninsula was soon transformed into a maze of trenches, saps, and strong points, zigzagging through the rough countryside. Both sides mined and countermined each other, while on the surface, skirmishes were fought all the time over the narrow plateaus, steep ridges, and hilltops.
here.
Places like Dead Man's Ridge, Battleship Hill, or Lone Pine were constantly contested, and yet, at Anzac Cove, the men found ways to communicate with the enemy. No one wanted to die needlessly, so sometimes instead of bombs, they might throw a pack of cigarettes over the parapets or toss across a can of bully beef. The French are...
That's interesting.
If you go back to the picture where the guys
that's
serving
something
coffee,
that's something I wanted to do.
Yeah, it looks like one is an Aussie
Yep.
and the other one is an Ottoman.
Yep, we have a member of Anzac who is basically giving some water or something to drink to the Ottoman. So it's a pretty cool little exchange that you see going on right here.
Right.
I wonder if the Ottoman is wounded in the way that he's lying down, or maybe they're just both relaxing there, laying down. What's interesting is that the Ottoman doesn't have his rifle, so it's just Aussie does.
Yeah.
So ready to continue?
Anzac Cove, the men found ways to communicate with the enemy. No one wanted to die needlessly, so sometimes instead of bombs, they might throw a pack of cigarettes over the parapets or toss across a can of bully beef. The French on the far right at Helles had similar live and let live arrangements with their enemies. Like if both sides had to cross a certain gully to bring in fresh water, they would plant little flags or signposts, and as long as no one ventured further than that, they would not be shot at. In the British sector of Helles, though, there was no such fraternization. Ottoman High Command loathed the British imperialists and thought them to be the major aggressor in this war. Both sides fired at the slightest sign of movement, harassed each other day and night with artillery, and gave no quarter during advances.
Wow, it is a really interesting thing to observe that depending on what front you're sent to, like which fighting group you're a part of, it will completely change the way you experience the war. Because on one side, there was like a mutual sign of respect, and they both just wanted to live and let live, and they had all these different like little unsaid rules in place where they would show compassion towards one another, even though it's a completely like cold-blooded war. There would be moments of humanity, as you saw in that one photo. But then, meanwhile, over here on this one front, I don't know if front is the right term to use, but rather this one area where there's two sides combating each other, there's zero fraternization, as he put it, that was allowed.
Yeah, I think as you said, with any hint of movement, they would shell the area.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see the contrast between the two, where one side is there like putting out little flags to say, hey, this is the safe zone.
Right.
And, so.
The overall situation at Gallipoli changed little over the summer. The Allies needed more men and artillery to achieve anything bigger than taking the next ridge before them, and the Ottomans had all the time in the world to strengthen their defenses. Here and there, brave attacks and successful bluffs continued to improve the Allied positions, but they did not change the overall stalemate, and larger assaults led to massacres and huge casualties for both sides. While the Ottomans were defending their homeland against foreign invaders, the sense of the whole point of the campaign began to be lost among the Allies. Clearly, they were not winning this battle, and clearly they were not advancing towards Constantinople. They could not even advance towards the next ridge without losing friends and comrades. The dehydration due to the constant lack of water, which they had to import from across the sea, the ever-present sniper fire, the flies, fever, lice, dysentery, morale plummeted, as did the health of the soldiers. Because life at Gallipoli was never safe. You could dodge bullets, you could dodge shells, but it was harder to dodge illness or dodge exhaustion. High command was aware of the lack of progress, but what to do? Send in more men in the hope of achieving something? Was victory even still possible? And if not, how to end this? British Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener feared the loss of British prestige in the Islamic world if they retreated. Such a retreat might also encourage other nations to join the Central Powers. But you know, the common soldiers cared little for such concerns.
Right.
They will never.
Yeah, that's not their issue. They because when you're an individual, you just care about, are you going to make it home to your family?
Surviving.
You could care less whether it saves face in front of other countries. Sure. You just want to go home. And then also just to note, you know how we saw that previous image
Just
before?
remind me of the same.
Yeah, this is
Thinking the
another one of those interesting images where you see an Ottoman and an Anzac member, or in this case maybe it's a British member because he has a cap. But either way, you have an Allied forces member and you have an Ottoman member, so you have two opposing sides, and they're just sharing a moment with each other. So really neat to see.
Leave our hearts or fade away. Live forever. They were far too young to die in such a way.
August was supposed to change things. A new landing at Suvla Bay that would open the possibility of a left hook, and in concert with a breakout attempt at Anzac Cove, would disrupt the Ottoman hold over the peninsula and finally open up a way to the Sarıyer Ridge. Diversions for the landing at Suvla took place all over the peninsula. But though there was still a lot of fight left in the exhausted Anzac troops, the plans of high command were simply out of range of what was physically possible. And the landings at Suvla Bay faced the same problems as the landings before that we saw in part 1. Under fire and in unmapped territory, the men quickly lost track of time and space. And although they advanced quite a bit inland, they were soon checked by determined Ottoman reserves and had to dig in. They did not meet any of their objectives. The August battles brought no major changes to the overall situation. A fatalistic mood set in over the Allied forces. In September and October, men and guns were further worn out, and the weather began to turn. The heat and the flies vanished, sure, but the approaching winter was even more threatening. The thought of evacuation began making the rounds. By October 14th, General Sir Ian Hamilton, in charge since the beginning, was dismissed, and General Sir Charles Munro took his place. Munro had a more realistic approach than Hamilton. By the end of October, he had visited all 3 landing sites and came to the conclusion that the whole campaign was nothing short of total disaster. The Ottomans still occupied the dominating heights, and the overall lack of sufficient artillery and supplies would not challenge that. He telegraphed his opinions back to Kitchener, but Kitchener didn't believe him and went to see for himself. And yeah, Kitchener could barely hide his shock over the whole situation either. By the end of November, the War Committee had approved the evacuation. Problem was that this is easier said than done. Immediate evacuation would result in a massacre if the Ottomans caught them halfway through, but with winter approaching, they could not wait for long. The temperatures dropped significantly. Heavy rain poured in from the heights down into the trenches. Cold winds from the sea hit the exposed troops.
Wow, it's an interesting dilemma, right? Because it's like a catch-22 scenario. I'm wondering in this case, would they have been able to like coordinate with the Ottomans and agree to that they would leave in exchange for safe passage, or is that even a possibility that's on the table?
Interesting thought. Yeah, I'm sure.
Because that's what I would thought. Was that one of the things they considered? Would that have been possible, or would that not have been a possibility?
Yeah, given the players, who knows? But that's an interesting thought on that. Let us know what you think in the comments.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm not sure how the Ottoman High Command would have responded, but at least from the common foot soldier perspective, as we saw all these like different moments where they're like sharing waters with one another, and there are all these different things where it's like live and let live. I would have thought this would have been another great possible outcome where the live and let live was, hey, we'll leave, which means there'll be less of you dying, and you grant a safe passage, which means there'll be less of us dying.
Yeah.
So it seems like it would have been a benefit to both sides, at least for the common foot soldier.
Right.
So.
Frostbite grew rampant. Although the Ottoman soldiers were in the same boat, they at least had a short supply chain, bolstered by gifts of things like winter clothing from the people of Constantinople. The only real option for the Allies was to evacuate without the Ottomans realizing it. The plan was that they would lull the Ottomans by reducing activities to a minimum. The Anzacs and the 80,000 men at Suvla Bay were first. As they stopped responding to the enemy's shelling, the Ottomans came forward, but were met with rifle fire. As this was repeated, the Ottomans got used to the silence. Over weeks, the Allied lines were gradually thinned out until only a screening force remained. Sappers began booby-trapping the trenches, supply stores, and dugouts with tripwire explosives. On the night of December 18th, the final evacuation began. The Ottomans suspected nothing and, in fact, were only alerted by the fire and explosions as the last men set the fuses.
Wow.
The evacuation was a masterpiece in planning and execution. But what about Hellas?
Yeah, so far, before we move on to Hellas, really impressive the way that he described it. It sounds like it was executed perfectly. The fact that the enemy didn't have a clue.
Something was done right here.
Yeah, something was done
In
right.
this case.
But wow, it's crazy to think that your enemy you don't even realize that the people you're fighting on the other side of the trench are no longer there. So interesting.
Now that the Ottomans knew what was up, could they be fooled again? By diverse patterns of counterfire, periods of silence, they gave the Ottomans a false sense of activity until January 8th, when the evacuation of Hellas finally began. The last men in the trenches were almost crazy with nerves, because if the Ottomans had sniffed out their little trick, they could easily overrun the beaches. But the night remained silent. Everything that could not be brought away was booby-trapped or destroyed. It was not until the last British soldiers had left the beaches that the first Ottoman patrols caught wind of the evacuation. The evacuations were complete successes.
Yeah, at least there's some good news there. What I'm wondering is, as an intriguing fact, is did some Ottoman patrols realize that what was going on and see them that they're evacuating, and they purposely waited till everyone left in order to cause less bloodshed, or was it really just not a single one of them had a single clue?
Right.
It's kind of an interesting little thing to
That's
know.
an interesting thought.
Because I mean, if you're one of those like patrols, right, and if you have your own like little group of soldiers, and you see that the enemy is retreating, it's like, what's the point of if they're gonna leave anyway? Why sacrifice your men when you could just wait out a day and they'll be gone, right? So
At the shoreline, blood of heroes stains the land. Light a
this is some really powerful images.
Yeah, the images really are.
Wow, look at that.
The full story.
What's also interesting to know about that little gravesite they just showed, right? The like burial, like mini cemetery, I
Right.
guess you could improvised cemetery. Is look at that. They put barbed
Surrounded
wire
by barbed
around.
wire.
It's interesting that they did that. I'm wondering what the reason for that was. Just to say, hey, stay away from these graves, because obviously it could be you could go past the barbed wire, but just an interesting thing to note that they took the time to set up the barbed wire around the graves.
Or I'm curious if they were shallow graves, if they did it to ensure that wild animals would not go and then bury
Oh, interesting.
the bodies.
Right. Yeah. There's several different reasons why they could have done that, but
Yeah.
it's just an interesting thing to note.
The full story of this battle, the Dardanelles, is clad in many tales and legends, which I encourage you to look up for yourself. But it had some lasting effects, even long beyond the war. For the Australians and New Zealanders, the Anzacs, the fight for Gallipoli grew into a part of their national identity. It was their baptism in fire and the beginning of a unique legacy separate from Britain and the British Empire. And for the Turks, the battle actually served to form a bond of friendship between those former enemies.
Wow.
They shared the same feelings of pride and valor, sacrifice and loss. This is perhaps best expressed by the following words attributed to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country.
Wow.
Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side. Here, in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are at peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well.
Wow, what a powerful quote from this,
Extremely powerful quote to
from
think.
this military leader.
Yeah, not only is like forgiveness of the enemy, but like even like referring to them as like their sons as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I can definitely see that Sabaton took some inspiration from this exact quote, because they even use the exact phrase in one of the lyrics.
We are brothers now.
But also mothers wipe away your tears, right? Which is also is in this quote.
Was in there.
And it just shows the level of mutual respect they had for one another, and the irony that a conflict actually brought these two different sides even closer to one another. Of course, later after the fact, but it's still amazing to know, because for a lot of countries, if this were to happen, most of the time it would just be the resentment would stay for generations, and here it did the opposite. So there's a rekindlance.
What I find interesting is what Indy said with Australia. They took it on as almost a coming of age for the country, because they were subjects of the British Empire, and they were, and still are today, tied in as part of a commonwealth in economics and so forth. Completely different nation and what they do, but it seemed like a coming of age for Australia. We are our own nation. We are our own country.
Like it seems like in a lot of the conflicts leading up to this point, maybe they're in the shadow of Britain. So any of their major successes or any participation that was on their part was just kind of looped in under Britain. But in this case, this was kind of more of a it was kind of put a spotlight on their contribution to the war effort as well.
Right.
So it gives that level of recognition that they deserved.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Let's take a look.
Yeah, see, there's the quote. Wipe your tears. And as foe turn to friend and forgive, which leads into that quote as well. Wow.
Now, at the very beginning, you said this song took us from Sweden to Turkey. Can you tell them a little bit about that?
Yeah, the whole idea, I mean, we get a lot of emails like, write a song about this, write a song about that. But when it actually came to Cliffs of Gallipoli, we were playing a show in Netherlands.
In the Netherlands?
Yes.
Okay.
And a guy came, he was a songwriter, a songwriter doing several big artists in Turkey.
Okay.
He explained that I have an idea how you can write a song about something that you probably never heard about. And it's about my home country, Turkey.
Okay.
And a battle that took place there. And it will fit totally to your music.
Wow.
This guy came prepared and he gave me this whole bunch of papers.
Like a little
But
pig.
you knew the name Gallipoli before, or no? Had you heard?
No, I mean, this is a song that has many years in the making.
Right.
It became like something for Turkish people. This was very important.
Yeah.
It is important for the Anzacs as well, for Australians and New Zealanders.
And forming that friendship between the enemies, between the Turks and the Anzacs.
That was one of the things that inspired us from the beginning, like the speech about the Turk or the memorial wall,
Wow.
Right.
where it says that here no nationality needs to be mattered because here we are all brothers. This stone was very important in the inspiration for writing the song. After we released it, we were not sure like what is gonna happen now, but then we got the invitation because this guy, he had some contacts in Turkey, and he was like, guys, I think that you need to perform this song in Turkey.
That's cool.
And I was excited because we had never been there, so of course I'm always open to playing in new
Haggis
places.
is in the background.
When we were sitting in the restaurant, all the TVs, we constantly saw advertisement for us.
Wow.
This was something we'd never seen before.
Yeah.
Today, we've
Yeah, but
we've
this
Probably a
was-
huge concert.
Yeah. This is more than 10 years ago. So this was the first time we actually saw like, wow, we're on TV.
Yeah.
We saw the interest for Sabaton once we landed there was ridiculously big. And what people would do when we just wanted to have an ice cream, they would clear tables for us in a bar so that we can have an ice cream. The big event was, of course, Sabaton performing in a TV.
Yeah.
And this was a quite big television channel. and nothing that we have ever done before. But it was hilarious how it worked on set, because in a big TV station, normally you have strict rules what is happening. But in this case, I think that all of them were so excited about having us there that they didn't care about rules.
That's awesome.
So we were allowed to do whatever we wanted in the studio and play as much as we wanted. So it ended up with us playing pretty much a set, like a gig
On Turkish TV?
on Turkish TV, and there were people in the crowd.
Oh,
and,
cool.
That's really neat.
sitting there, and it was an absolutely amazing story, and I loved that thing was what the Cliffs of Gallipoli led to.
Well, thank you very much, Per. Okay, that's it for Cliffs of Gallipoli, and this was Sabaton History.
Left the letters in the sand. Such waste of life.
Wow.
So that's it for this week. And if you become a Patreon on some of the levels, you have a possibility to get a special edition of the Sabaton new album and all the previous albums. So don't forget to become a subscriber of the YouTube channel, become a Patreon, and see you soon.
Nice.
What another really outstanding overview of the history there and summary of it. And I was thinking as they were wrapping up for the group to be on national TV in Turkey, but the idea of them how they were welcomed.
Right.
And there were no rules for them to broadcast their set and do their gig on TV. It just shows that the idea of forgiveness and welcoming and becoming having a sense of brotherhood, and that's just really, really neat. And it all started by also someone having the courage to approach the band saying, hey, do a song in my hometown.
Yeah.
Here's what happened.
Yeah, and they even came prepared. Like it was like a little pitch. They had all this stuff, all these different details of the conflict to get them interested, to get the band interested, and say, hey, this is something that's really worth covering. And something that was pointed out in the comments that was recommending this video was that there's a lot of mutual respect between both sides, and the way this second overview was closed out in a really beautiful way, especially showing that one quote that it looked like it was engraved into a stone wall. A stone wall that's like a little monument or like that pays tribute to what happened. And it is a really beautiful conclusion to see that both sides, neither one of them had resentment for one another, but they made peace with what happened. So that was a really beautiful one, and it had a happy, feel good closure to it. So
yeah. And I think about him sharing about that one person who approached him saying, why don't you think about doing this song? And there's so many times I think we need to just have the courage to do something like that. I have an idea. Can I share it with you? And let's see where it goes.
Yeah, and ideas can be taken a long way.
Yeah, because his idea ended up creating a song and creating a history channel, and it's been very educational for me. It gives me things to really think about and reflect.
Yeah, and we're super excited to do more of these because every one of these I feel like has been fantastic. The music is awesome. The story behind the music is awesome, and they do a great job of really finding these cool little events that happen in history and bringing them to light and not letting them stay buried.
Yeah, they're so meaningful. They're so deep and meaningful, and you're absolutely right. Not leaving them buried, bringing them up to light. Let us remember and honor the lost lives. But it also makes me think about honoring those even today who are still living, where I personally have a chance to honor them and show a certain respect.
Right.
Yeah. Great stuff.
Yeah. With that being said, we really enjoyed this one. We hope you guys did too. Make sure if you want to see more of us, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell icon to be notified of any future videos. Make sure you recommend any other songs you like for us to watch. This one was fantastic, and we're so excited to see more. So with that being said, we hope you have a great rest of your week, and stay tuned.
Stay tuned, and for all of those who recognize and celebrate Anzac Day, we're with you and wish you the best on Anzac Day, April 25th.
Yep. All right, guys. Take care.
You won't die if you try, you just buy.